Mother-in-law announced at Thanksgiving dinner that she was embarrassed to introduce me to her friends. She said it with a smile, the kind that's designed to look like a joke but lands like a slap. My husband's entire family laughed. He looked at his plate. I just nodded, quietly ate my mashed potatoes, and drove home alone because he wanted to stay for dessert. 3 months later, his mother walked into the conference room where I was sitting at the head of the table, looked directly at me, and asked my assistant if the CEO had arrived yet. Let me back up. I had been with my husband for 4 years before we got married, which you'd think would be enough time for his family to figure out who I was. It wasn't. To them, I was always just the girl he brought home from some networking event. The quiet one who didn't talk much at holiday dinners, who showed up in clean but unremarkable clothes, who drove a sensible car and never once dropped a number or a title or a name into conversation. His mother, from the very first dinner, had assessed me the way you assess a piece of furniture: functional, inoffensive, forgettable. Her name was Helene. She had the kind of energy that announced itself when she entered a room, all silk blouses and gold jewelry and opinions delivered as facts. His father was warmer, but mostly absent from any conversation that didn't involve golf or real estate. My husband, Ethan, was their only son. And in Helene's world, Ethan deserved a certain kind of wife. Not a better wife, a more visible one. She'd made her feelings clear in the way women like her always do. Never directly, always through the architecture of small comments. She'd ask what I did again at every gathering, as if she genuinely couldn't retain the information. She'd introduce me to her friends as Ethan's wife. She works in tech, delivered in a tone that somehow made tech sound like a euphemism for something embarrassing. Once, at a birthday dinner for Ethan's father, she'd leaned across the table and said, in front of 8 people, that she had always imagined Ethan with someone more social, more present, someone who could really be a partner to him in his world. I'd smiled and poured myself more wine. Ethan said she meant well. He always said she meant well. I'd stopped arguing with that a long time ago. The Thanksgiving comment was different only in its specificity. We'd been at the table for maybe 40 minutes when one of his aunts asked Helene about the Junior League gala she chaired every spring. Helene launched into a detailed account of the venue change, the new caterer, the drama with the florist. Then she pivoted, the way she always did, to asking who among the family would be available to attend. She went around the table. When she got to me, something flickered across her face. "I'll be honest," she said, in that breezy voice she used for things that weren't breezy at all. "I'm never quite sure how to explain what you do to people. It's not that it isn't impressive in its way, it's just, you know how it is. These are legacy donors. Old money. They want to see a certain kind of couple." The table laughed. Even Ethan's cousin laughed. It was the kind of laughter that papers over something awful with social noise. I said, "That's probably fair, Helene," and went back to my food. I want to be clear about something. I was not silently plotting. I was not sitting there with a chess move in mind, savoring some elaborate revenge. I was just tired. Tired in the way you get tired when you've been performing patients for 4 years and you're starting to wonder why. I had a company to run. I had 200 employees. I had a board meeting in 9 days and a Series C that was either about to close or about to collapse. And instead of being home on a Sunday working through term sheets, I was eating dry turkey and being told I wasn't decorative enough for a charity gala. I drove home alone that night, like I said. I didn't cry. I just turned the heat up and let the silence of the car fill the space where my husband's voice wasn't. I should tell you how I got here. I was 22 when my father got sick. It happened a summer before I was supposed to start my MBA at Stanford. Stage 3 colorectal cancer, diagnosed in June, surgery in July. He was 61 and had never taken a sick day in his adult life. The diagnosis hit him like a wall. It hit my mother worse. She'd spent 30 years building a life around being his partner, and suddenly that life needed a manager, a caretaker, an advocate who could sit in oncology waiting rooms and understand what a doctor was saying and ask the right follow-up questions. I deferred my enrollment. My younger brother was still an undergrad and wasn't built for the medical and financial complexity of what we were dealing with. My mother was in shock, so I stayed. I handled the insurance appeals, the treatment coordination, the second opinions. I moved back into my childhood home in suburban Ohio and slept in my old bedroom and drove my dad to chemo every Thursday morning for 8 months. He made it. Remission by the following spring. By that point, I had missed my enrollment window. I could have reapplied. I probably should have. But somewhere in those 8 months of sitting in waiting rooms and reading clinical trial summaries and fighting with insurance adjusters on hold for 45 minutes at a stretch, I had started building something. A healthcare navigation software tool, nothing fancy at first, just a system I'd built to organize my dad's treatment documents, insurance correspondence, and prescription management in one place. Something I wished had existed when we needed it. I showed it to a friend who worked at a health tech incubator. She showed it to her boss. 3 weeks later, I had a meeting that turned into a check that turned into a company. I deferred again indefinitely this time and moved to Chicago with a laptop and a list of hospitals I wanted to cold call. I didn't tell my family much about it. They knew I was working on something with healthcare software. My brother thought I was doing IT work for hospitals. My dad, still recovering, told everyone I was in computers. When I went home for Christmas that first year, my mother's sister asked me when I was going to go back to school because she had a cousin who knew someone at Northwestern's Kellogg program and it was never too late. I smiled and said I was thinking about it. The company was called Verdant Health. Within 2 years, we had contracts with 4 major hospital systems in the Midwest. Within 4, we were in 22 states. The platform had expanded from navigation software into a full care coordination suite, discharge planning, social determinants screening, care gap alerts, the kind of infrastructure that sits behind the scenes of a health system and keeps patients from falling through the cracks between appointments. By the time I married Ethan, I was running a company with $40 million in annual revenue and a board that included 2 former HHS officials and the founding partner of one of the largest health tech venture funds on the East Coast. I had not told Ethan's family this in any particular detail. It had never come up in a way that made detail feel natural, and I had long since stopped trying to explain it to people who had already decided what I was. Ethan knew, of course. He was proud of me in private, in the way he'd squeeze my hand after a hard week and say that he didn't know how I did it. But he'd never really pushed back on his family's perception of me. He'd mentioned once, early on, that it might be easier to just let them get to know me over time than to lead with credentials. I had agreed, thinking it was a short-term arrangement. That had been 4 years ago. The Thanksgiving comment finally broke something loose in me. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. A decision. I'm not going to pretend what happened next was entirely coincidental. In February, 3 months after Thanksgiving, I was in the middle of finalizing our Series C, $45 million, led by a Boston-based growth equity firm called Meridian Capital Partners. It was the largest fundraising round in Verdant's history, and we'd spent 11 months getting there. The lead partner at Meridian's Chicago office was a man named Franklin. He'd been our primary contact throughout the process. 2 weeks before the close, he called to let me know he wanted to bring a few colleagues to the final partnership meeting at our offices. One of them, he mentioned, was his newest senior associate, a high performer who'd been brought in from a boutique advisory firm and was expected to lead the firm's healthcare portfolio going forward. I asked for the name, out of habit. Franklin said it. I'm not going to say I felt the universe shift. I'm going to say I felt something small and quiet click into place, the way a lock does when the right key finds it. The name was Helene's maiden name, her professional name, the one she used for consulting work. I asked Franklin to confirm her full name. He did. I thanked him and ended the call. My COO, a woman named Beverly who had been with me since the 3rd year and who knew everything about my life that mattered, walked in 2 minutes later and found me standing at my office window, not quite smiling. "You look like someone who just found out something interesting," she said. "Ethan's mother is Franklin's new senior associate. She's coming to the final partnership meeting." Beverly stared at me. "Does she know it's your company?" "I don't think so," I said. "She doesn't really know what my company is." Beverly was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you want me to change the nameplate on your conference room door?" I laughed, which I needed. "No," I said. "I want everything exactly as it is." There was no trap. That's what I need to be clear about. I didn't send a decoy invitation or move the meeting or arrange anything theatrical. I simply did not call Helene. I did not call Ethan's father. I did not text my husband a heads up. The meeting was in my calendar. My name was on the building's directory. My photo was on the website, though admittedly not the most prominently placed one. If she Googled the company she was walking into, she would have found me in about 30 seconds. She hadn't Googled it. The morning of the meeting, I wore what I always wear to important presentations: a black blazer, dark slacks, good boots. Nothing flashy. I'd learned years ago that the goal in a room full of people who are trying to assess your credibility is to make your clothes so unremarkable that they have no choice but to listen to what you're saying. Beverly had set up the large conference room on the fourth floor. The Verdant logo was on the wall screen. Our product metrics were queued up in the deck. Our CFO was there, our head of clinical partnerships, and one of our board members who'd flown in from Boston. My assistant came in at 9:50 and said the Meridian team was in the lobby. I nodded and said to send them up. I heard them before I saw them, voices in the hallway, the kind of slightly elevated energy that visiting teams bring when they're trying to project confidence in a new space. The conference room door opened and Franklin came in first, hand extended, already talking. Behind him were two younger colleagues, and behind them was Helene. She looked exactly as she always did. Silk blouse, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, the particular posture of a woman who has spent decades being the most polished person in most rooms. She walked in mid-sentence, saying something to one of the younger associates, and then she stopped. Not because she saw me. She wasn't looking at me yet. She stopped because she was reading the wall screen, the Verdant Health logo, the tagline, the metrics underneath it. I watched the information travel across her face. Then she turned and she found me at the head of the table. We looked at each other for a moment that was much longer than a moment. "Hello, Helene," I said. My voice came out even. I was surprised by that. Her mouth opened, then closed. Then she looked at Franklin, as though he might have answers, and then she looked at the wall screen again, and then at me, and I watched her do the math in real time, the full calculation, the company name, the table I was sitting at, what it meant that I was sitting at, what it meant that I was sitting there, what it meant that she had not known. She started. "Why don't we get started?" I said, and I gestured to the chairs along the table. "Franklin, thank you for coming out. I know you had an early flight." The meeting began. Franklin presented Meridian's perspective on the deal terms and their thesis for the healthcare portfolio. I led Verdant's portion, the clinical outcomes data, the expansion roadmap, the unit economics. I was thorough. I was not showing off. I was just doing my job, the same job I'd been doing for 8 years, the same one Helene had never thought to ask about at a single family dinner. Helene sat in her chair and did not say a word for the first 40 minutes. When we reached the Q&A portion, she spoke once. Her voice was careful, the way you're careful when you're walking across ice and you're not sure how thick it is. "The Care Gap Alert module," she said, looking at the slide. "How are you managing the provider adoption problem? That's been a consistent barrier in the market." It was a good question, a genuinely good question. I answered it directly with numbers because I had lived this problem for 3 years and I knew the answer cold. She nodded once and wrote something down and didn't speak again. The meeting ended at noon. Franklin was warm, optimistic, said he'd have the final term sheet revisions to my CFO by the end of the week. People shook hands and began gathering their things. I walked Franklin to the elevator and thanked him for the partnership. When I came back to the conference room, it was empty except for Helene. She was standing by the window, her portfolio tucked under her arm. She'd been waiting. "I owe you an apology," she said, without preamble. I didn't say anything. I walked to the other end of the room and pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. She turned away from the window. In the daylight, without the performance of a family gathering around her, she looked older than I usually thought of her. Tired in a way she'd never let herself appear at Thanksgiving. "I had no idea," she said. "I want you to know I genuinely didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "You never said." "No," I agreed. She was quiet for a moment. A long moment. Why? I thought about how to answer that, and I chose honesty because I was tired of performing patience. because every time I tried to say something, the conversation moved on. Or someone mentioned Ethan's promotion, or a house someone was building, or your gala, and after a while, I stopped. After a while, I realized that my accomplishments were only going to mean something to you if they came in a form you already recognized. And they don't. They never have. She absorbed that. I watched her do it, not defensively, which surprised me, but carefully, the way someone takes in a diagnosis they've been dreading. The Thanksgiving comment, she said. I've thought about that, I know. It was cruel. I'm not sure why I said it. I think I'd made up my mind about you a long time ago and I just kept saying the same thing in different ways. I didn't respond to that. There wasn't much to say. She started and then stopped, and I could see her looking for the right word, the word that didn't cost too much but meant something. She didn't find it quickly, which I actually respected. I'd like to do better, she finally said. If you'll allow that. I looked at her for a long moment. I'll close the Series C, I said, if the terms are right, and then we'll see. She nodded. It wasn't the warm reconciliation she probably imagined, and I think she knew that. But it was honest, and I think she knew that too. She left. I sat in the empty conference room for a few minutes and looked out at the city. Beverly appeared in the doorway. How'd it go? Fine, I said. The meeting, or both, I said. Fine. The Series C closed 3 weeks later. $45 million. It was the biggest day of my company's life, and I celebrated it the way I always celebrated things that mattered. With Beverly and our CFO and 2 attorneys and a bottle of champagne that was better than anything that had ever been served at a junior league gala. Ethan texted to say congratulations and that he was proud of me and that his mother had called him. I texted back, I know. Talk when you get home. That conversation was long and overdue, and I won't put all of it here. But it ended with Ethan saying that he understood, finally, why I had stopped explaining myself to his family and why that had cost us something, and that he was sorry he hadn't pushed back sooner. He cried a little, which I hadn't expected. I think he'd been carrying more guilt than he'd let himself feel. We had a lot of work to do. We both knew it. Helene called me 6 weeks after the close, not to talk about the deal. That was handled by our respective teams. She called on a Sunday afternoon, which felt deliberate, and she was brief. She was chairing a roundtable for her firm's healthcare portfolio companies in the spring. She thought Verdant would be a good fit to present. She wanted to know if I'd be interested. I told her I'd have my team look at the calendar and get back to her. She said, of course, take your time. And then, after a pause, you've built something remarkable. I should have known what it was a long time ago. I said thank you, and I meant it, and we hung up. I don't have a tidy ending to offer. Helene and I are not close. We are cordial in a way that is respectful and real, which is something I wouldn't have predicted in November. Ethan and I are still working on the longer conversation. Some of it is hard, but we are talking, which is more than we were doing before. My dad still calls what I do computers. But last spring, he told someone at church that his daughter ran a company that was in 40 states and had just raised $45 million, and that she'd taken care of him when he was sick, and that she was the toughest person he knew. His voice cracked a little when he told me he'd said it. I didn't need Helene's gala. I never needed her approval. But I did need Ethan to finally see what he'd been allowing, and I needed to stop pretending that patience is the same thing as peace. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be exactly what you are, quietly and completely, and let the room catch up to you. I keep coming back to the moment Helene walked into that conference room and stopped reading the wall screen. Not because it felt like victory, it didn't, not exactly, but because of what I saw on her face in that half second before she found me. It was the look of someone realizing they'd been wrong for a very long time and that the wrongness had cost them something real. I recognized it. I'd worn a version of it myself years earlier, sitting in a hospital waiting room wondering if I'd made the right call, dropping everything to come home. What I've come to understand is that the way things unfolded wasn't luck, and it wasn't karma in any mystical sense. It was just consequence. Every choice leaves a mark. Helene's choice to decide who I was before she knew me left a mark on our relationship for 4 years. My choice to keep building quietly without needing her to understand it left a mark on my company. Ethan's choice to stay silent left a mark on our marriage. None of it happened in a vacuum. The conference room moment was just the place where all those marks finally became visible at once. I think about what it actually took to get there, not the fundraising, but the years before the fundraising. Moving back to Ohio when I was 22, learning what a portacath was, fighting insurance companies on hold, sleeping in my childhood bedroom while my friends were starting careers I planned to have. That required something from me that I didn't fully name at the time. I know now that it was integrity, not the performative kind. Not integrity as a value you post on a wall, but the quieter version. Doing the hard thing because it's the right thing, even when no one is watching, even when it costs you something you can't get back. And then staying in that garage those first years when everything was unproven and the family narrative was already set in stone, that required something else entirely. It required a kind of stubbornness I don't think I was born with. I think I built it slowly out of necessity, out of having no other option. Grit isn't glamorous. It's mostly just refusing to stop on days when stopping would be easier. I refused a lot of days. Beverly saw most of them. What I wish I'd understood sooner is that intelligence isn't only what you know. It's knowing what questions to ask and when and of whom. I asked the right questions in oncology waiting rooms and insurance appeals. I asked them in pitch meetings. I asked them of myself in the car driving home after Thanksgiving when I finally admitted that patience and peace are not the same thing and I had been confusing them for years. Helene asked me a good question in that meeting about provider adoption. It was the first time she'd ever engaged with my actual work, and it was a real question, not a polite one. I gave her a real answer. Something shifted in that exchange. Small, but real. I don't need her admiration. I never did. But I find now that I have something better, her respect. And the difference between those two things is the whole story.